Thanks for joining us again after the break. I am Andrew Cox. I'm here with a discussion with Kenny Lund, the Executive Vice President at the Lund Company. He is now in Pasadena, California, joining us. How are we today, Kenny?
Oh, doing great. Good to see you, Andrew.
No, it is good to see you here as well. I want to jump right in. We've only got 20 minutes here, so let's get right to the punch. To us here at FreightWaves and to many in the industry, the Lund Company has kind of seen it's synonymous with a gold standard of produce transportation and brokerage services. But briefly, give us your little elevator pitch on why you've been asked to handle this discussion and why you're uniquely qualified to tell us what food shippers want.
So I just celebrated 31 years in the industry, and when my father started the company in 1976, we could only handle exempt commodities, so that included produce. And so we've grown up as a company handling fresh produce. It's about 40% of what we do now. We handle all kinds of products, but that's still our favorite item is fresh produce, feeding the U.S. and Canada. And I spent years on the brokerage desk, moving lots of loads of fresh produce, a lot into the South. And I did the very first loads of produce with Costco, who back in 1991 and 92 was adding produce into their mix. Before that, they sold almost exclusively dry freight. And so I got to be a part of that. And now they're still a big part of our business, our largest customer, especially in produce.
Well, lovely, Kenny. So Lund Company is, of course, headquartered in California. That's where you join us today. And I wanted to kind of reference a piece that you had written that you and I have talked about briefly off air, about a piece you wrote at the end of March, and it was titled 4 Days in LA. And during this piece, you touched about how a city of 10 million people only has roughly 3 or 4 or 5 days worth of food on hand in store shelves to keep residents fed. But the big point is here that you weren't writing this to scare people. You were writing this to kind of congratulate and to put notice on the efficiency and the complexity of the food supply chains in our country. And, you know, as we spoke off air a little bit, we've become accustomed to having an abundance of different fruits and vegetables all over the world and all over the continent on our store shelves all the time. And really, we take it for granted. We didn't know the extent to which we did take this for granted until those store shelves were empty just a couple months ago. So in that 4 days in LA, you speak a little bit about the changes in consumer preferences that have kind of forced grocery stores in particular to change not only their stores, but their supply chains. So I wanted to punt the question to you to talk a little bit about how consumer preferences have forced these grocery stores to change their stores and their supply chains.
Yeah, so it has been really interesting to see how stores have changed over the years. I'm old enough. I'm not that old, but old enough to remember that summer fruit was just that. You could only get it in the summer. You could get watermelon in the summer, and really no other times. Especially back east, they would see this a lot more, as you would only see maybe get strawberries for an 8-week window. And now, and I don't know if it's availability has changed the taste or if people's tastes have changed, but now people expect to have watermelon, cantaloupe, honeydew, peaches, oranges, pretty much year-round, all throughout the United States. And our retailers have done an amazing job. And when you go in, I love to see the retailers have changed their stores to where the produce is right up front. Where you see it used to be in the back and dry back there, but a lot of them, they're right up front. It's one of their biggest sales items. And so people expect that. And for years and years and years, as we've walked into stores, we've only seen abundance. And maybe if there's a hurricane coming or something, there might be, kind of maybe a couple days where we have some shortages. But this COVID-19 thing has been unbelievable, to where we have seen empty shelves and have seen scarcity, and to where people have really thought, why, what happened? Why do we have this? And so it ended up the 4 days article being a little predictive, I guess, of how tight those supplies are, people that go and study this stuff in college, they came out and said, you need to have just-in-time inventory. And in food, we've been doing that for a long time, having just in time, and we're not really good at just in case that they have in some of the manufacturing as they're building up a lot more in inventory. So it's been amazing to quietly behind the scenes have been a part to help build this supply chain that is so efficient, but maybe too efficient.
Maybe so. So I want to. You mentioned food manufacturers in specifically there. I wanted to ask you a question there. Over the past 4 months, we've seen, and I want to say this idea comes from John Brewer at the Carls and Hardy Jr. I spoke to him in prep for this conversation, but he kind of pointed at the fact that the different subsectors of this industry, of specifically the food production industry, have proven more nimble than the manufacturing sector. So the logistics and the distribution of these goods have proven to be a little bit more nimble than the manufacturing. And I say that specifically kind of aimed at the meat factories, in which we've seen them not really learn lessons early on and have to shut down. And the meat factories are so heavily, are very tightly. I mean, one plant that you and I spoke about, 4 or 5% of the total pork production came from one plant. So with all that said, my question to you is, what are the lessons that food shippers are learning or have learned during the last 3 or 4 months that will change the way that they've moving forward, that will help them ensure that we have enough food to make sure that we keep their workers safe? What are those lessons that they've learned, and how can they ensure to us that this will never happen again?
Boy, there's been such a consolidation in, especially in animal proteins and beef, pork, poultry, and we've now seen where a couple plants can be affected, and we had some shut down because they had too many employees test positive, and they're very critical, of course, in the production, so they've had to shut those down, and that has created shortages. Again, not so much empty shelves, but now, hey, you can go into a store and you can buy 2 items of beef or 2 items of chicken, and we're just not used to that. And maybe it's a little bit concentrated too much in a few hands, but we always see it kind of ebb and flow. We see it concentrate and then it disperse back out. If you look at the number of SKUs that are on in a particular store, it's gone up by thousands. With different culturals, different cultural mixes, and just the variety that people demand now. And then companies like Amazon, who have made every item available within a couple days to all over, really has made the demand change to, I want everything and I want it now. That's how hard is that in logistics? But back to these the big protein plants. They're going to have to diversify a little bit more. They're going to have to maybe, unfortunately, they're going to automate more too. Because the weak link has been the employees.
So on the topic of consumer preferences and the changing of consumer preferences, I do have one question for you, and this is really focused on the farm to fork movement, or that buy local movement. And really, I question: do you think this is an opportunity for these nationwide, massive domestic shippers to partner with local communities, with local farmers, to try to bring them up together, or do you see this kind of as a big threat, as a possible threat to their market share and their dominance?
So if you allow me to tell a kind of a funny story about local produce, my dad was on the Board of Regents of a university up in the Northwest, and the student union voted we're only going to buy locally sourced produce. And then they got really mad because they had no bananas and no strawberries and no cantaloupe, and because none of that was grown locally. And if it was only for a very short time of the year. So they quickly realized that local is not really a thing, especially if you want bananas, because none of them are grown in the U.S. But where local is really making a big comeback is in greenhouses. And some of the producers, some of the farmers are doing greenhouses close to where they would normally normally deliver to. And so you have highly efficient greenhouses working on maybe a half an acre or 1 acre that are producing enough some produce for that area. And so that's where locals kind of making a better comeback. But they realize, you know what, we have such an amazing distribution system that we really can't define local. Does that mean within 10 miles? Does that mean within the state? Does that mean within the country? And so that's kind of gone by the wayside. But we see more and more produce being grown in greenhouses. And with that, there's been a big trend. California used to produce as much produce as the rest of the United States combined. So 50% of the produce comes out of California. That is shifting now because California has been so hard on the farmers with dramatic over-regulation. And now a lot of that is shifted to Texas, to Arizona, and especially to Mexico. And we now have more produce loads originating in Texas, and a lot of that's coming across from Mexico, than from California. I never thought I would see that in my lifetime.
Oh, hey, that's news to me here at FreightWaves, even though I haven't noticed that trend at either, but that's remarkable. You know, you said that's something you never thought you'd see. You've been in this industry a very long time. Like you said, you've been in here over 3 decades. I've only been here less than 3 years, so a big knowledge gap there. So forgive me if I sound ignorant here, but when doing research for our conversation here, I came across a 13-year-old article, one written in 2007 from a major food shipper, in which they talked about the challenges that are plaguing the industry and specifically challenging them. And the 3 of them are the things I see today. We see visibility, communications, and long unload and loading times. So my question to you, as a 3-decade veteran of this industry, Ken, why is it so difficult to get past what are seemingly very easy or simple problems to solve? Why is this industry not pushed past those?
So I think if we had stayed with the way things were 30 years ago and then worked on those 3 things, we'd have been able to accomplish it. The problem is it's an amazingly diverse and complex delivery system that we have for the goods across the United States. So delivering strawberries is very different than delivering nuts and bolts, and it's very complex. And so when produce is going, it can go 24/7. You can be loading 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and that just blows the mind out of some people that are doing, you know, very standard manufacturing. It's very difficult to do on the back end. There's a lot of information. Now, we sell a transportation management system, and it's built specifically for produce, and we have to have a lot more data fields to handle produce, just having the temperature. You know, so it's important not to know just on the traceability where the product is, but it's sometimes much more important to know what condition it is, what's the temperature. And so we're putting live devices on these in these loads. And now we're finding that sometimes those devices, they catch on fire because the battery's in them, because they're going up and down in temperature and they're getting run over by a forklift. And so you go 2 steps forward and 1 or 2 steps back at times. But I can tell you, my 31 years, the communication is better than it has ever been. The traceability is better than it has ever been. We have fewer claims because the equipment is better, the people understand it better, they're tied together better. The expectations have gone up dramatically, though. We can send a package via FedEx and we can track it all along the way, but we send a truckload of strawberries and we have gaps in that information. And so that expectation that I want to know where it is right now is a tough expectation. It used to be I knew where it was once a day. And that's not good enough anymore. So our expectations have changed, the complexity has changed, and that's just made those basic things that much more difficult. But we're getting there. We're getting there.
We are getting there. You're right, Kenny. So you are the former chairman of the United Fresh Supply Chain and Logistics Council, or one of the Supply Chain and Logistics Councils, rather. And you were recently part of a United Fresh webinar in which John Hawley, who is a longtime lobbyist and has worked on Capitol Hill for many years, he was on that call with you, and he serves as a lobbyist for United Fresh right now. And he spoke a little bit about the knowledge gap on Capitol Hill, and I found this really interesting. And you may not be able to speak to it a lot here, but I think you will because you've been here for so long. he says that Capitol Hill and Washington, they have a keen understanding of the restaurants and the final and the grocery store needs, and they also have a keen understanding of the farmers' needs, but that gap in between the farm to the fork, it has not been met, that there is a knowledge gap there. Why do you think that is? Why do you think that there's such a knowledge gap on Capitol Hill for the truckers and the companies actually moving the goods, and what can we do to solve it?
So, this is why FreightWaves is important. You make sense of a very complex system. And I found a lot of people that have been in the industry quite a long time don't understand it. Few people understand there are 400,000 plus trucking companies. I mean, that is unbelievable. That is mind-blowing to some people that are used to, how many airlines do we have? It's in the hundreds. Max. How many car companies do we have? It's less than 100. But we have 400,000 just trucking companies. Now you add intermodal and ship lines and air freight. It's an amazingly complex system. So even people in it have a tough time understanding it. Now you put in produce, which is handled almost entirely by carriers with 5 trucks or less. And so to try to get that across in Washington, D.C., when their mindset is the truck lines are all big. Trucks are always available. I just call and order it. It's like a cab in New York. I can get a cab all the time, any time of day or night. And they think that's the way trucks are. They don't understand regional shortages. They don't understand production of Class 8 trucks, how that down 6 months down the road, like right now we're in one of the lowest production points for Class 8 trucks. 6 months down the road, we are going to have some shortages of available trucks. That always follows. Dad always said, watch Class 8 truck sales. That's the best thing to watch. That's the most predictive number. So now you go into Washington, D.C., where they're dealing with so many different areas. And a lot of times I end up talking to somebody who's under 30 years old. And so they don't know what they don't know. And one time I saw it was several people from government. They were all under 30, and the panel was, how are we going to make produce transportation more efficient? And their answer was, it's got to go on rail, that we're going to shift, and all of the produce is going to go on rail. So I'm like raising my hand. I'm going, now 1% of produce goes on rail, of fresh produce, 1%. So I said, if we double the equipment available on rail to handle fresh produce, that's going to be 2% that's going to go. So you have to do just an unbelievable billions of dollars in investment to be able to handle fresh produce on rail. And then guess what? Who brings it to the railhead? The truck. And who picks it up at the railhead to deliver it? A truck. So it's not efficient. On paper and in government, that looks really efficient to put it on rail rather than putting it on trucks. But in practice, it doesn't work. My dad had a great relationship with David Dreyer, who was pretty high up in the House. And he always, anytime he had any question about transportation, he called my dad. And my dad could explain it to him.
Yeah, I found that interesting during that United Fresh webinar you did there. John Hawley said the same thing. He said that relationship between somebody in the transportation industry can be so important. He said when somebody comes to Capitol Hill and asks something of him, he always goes to you for the knowledge. And I'm glad you've been able to bring this knowledge to us today. I unfortunately have to bring this to a close. Thank you so much for joining us today, Mr. Kenny Lund. Have a good day, man.
Thank you, Andrew. Appreciate it.
All right, have a good one, guys.
And God bless the truckers.
God bless the truckers, no doubt.